This video walks you through what may be one of the most elaborate insurable calculations that we have done for clients. And I'm sharing this with you in aid of helping you understand not what we're recommending, but what a more sophisticated answer might look like to allow you to choose amongst the components to build yourself a more effective tool. Now, the chart I'm about to show you is a two-axis chart. So, on the left axis, we're doing a calculated index. And that calculated index is going to be effectively what you might think of as being, what is the insurable risk? Now, effectively, we're just going to be taking some estimates and multiplying them by probabilities. Now, for this client, their concern was there's a gap between this calculated insurable index and the actual insurance that they had, and they're concerned about that gap. Now, after extensive research, we came up with a number that was the correct amount of insurance that they should have had. Now, I want to be clear, it took a team of 35 risk experts to maintain this insurable requirement at this higher accuracy level. But it allows us to display to you the sophistication of what is possible in sneaking up on that number. Now, no matter how you cut it, the essence of this calculation is taking a look at some estimate of the dollar risk impact multiplied by likelihood, multiplied by the likelihood this thing's going to end up in some insurable claim. Nothing we can do to change that. We can just be more precise about the elements. And this client's concern, of course, was the gap caused by the inaccuracy of those elements. Now, if we took a look at different types of risk, fraud risk, the expenses related to protecting ourselves against reputational risk, criminal risks, we began to see a different proportion between the overall calculated risk index, the actual risk insurance that they had, and the correct amount of insurance that they should have had. And what we discovered is some risks were always in proportion. So in this example, this gap is about twice that gap. So what it meant is we could just use this calculated index and multiply it by 0.66 to come up with the insurance we should have. In other cases, we needed greater accuracy. So let's take a look at that greater accuracy. Now, we still ended up with an uncertainty. So we used risker charts to show the uncertainty around each calculated index. So again, this is not a precise science, but it allows us to get closer. So what are those elements? Well, they're the following. Number one is we still have to identify the risks. And this client, we discovered about 33% of the risks were not being collected in the risk register. So step one, with a vacuum cleaner, go get those risks. Then we discovered that they were putting their risks in bands as opposed to choosing the specific value. Now, of course, as soon as you band it, you've already built inaccuracies into your estimate. In some cases, we knew with great certainty what the claim could possibly be. So we should gather that data rather than guess. The next element is we began asking the risk champion, what is their confidence interval around that number? And again, in many cases, they knew. So if it was a contract and in the contract it said the maximum you can sue is $10 million, then we have a confidence interval that's quite high. It's plus or minus 0. In other cases, it was plus or minus 10 or plus or minus 20%. So again, that allows us to put those risk on and know what the accuracy level is. The next formula element that we evolved to is the risk probability. So we moved away from a scale of 1 to 3, because again, that's a bucket. If someone could give us a more precise estimate, 25% versus 30% versus 35%, then we can end up with a more precise estimate. So we got rid of the buckets and we moved to the probability of the event, not a likelihood bucket. So the next element is the probability of there actually being a claim. Now, if the risk event occurs, say someone slips and falls, that doesn't necessarily mean they're going to sue you. So there's a probability of the slip and fall event itself, and then separate from that, the probability given that type of event that someone will actually come and place a claim. So these two need to be considered because often we don't think about the likelihood of that actual event becoming a legal issue. Now, in some of our clients, they actually run a dual system. So for the rest of the world, they continue to score risks from 1 to 5 or 1 to 3. But for the insurance side, they do a second pass and they put in the probability of the event and the probability of a claim. So this is often done by the insurance expert, and we don't want to confuse the rest of the organization. So the next element is signal strength. Now I'll come back to that in a second. We began using more accurate data around the risk itself. So the next formula element was time to action. In Risk Connect, they call that velocity. So time to action is the amount of time between when you know that risk looks like it's manifesting and it actually occurs. So there's an elapsed time between, I don't know, when your car rusts away to when you lose it in a car accident. So the rust away event has a long time to action, whereas the accident happens in a nanosecond. Or the elapsed time between when you begin seeing a cyber assault occurring and when they finally have a breach. So the time to action gives you some information, because if you have a longer time to action, you have the opportunity of mitigating the risk. Now that doesn't mean you did, but at least you have the opportunity to do so. So we want to include that in the calculation, but we understand we don't always get around to mitigating it. Next element, the control effectiveness. The idea is we discovered that, of course, not all the controls are 100% effective. Now, when we score a risk likelihood and even impact, we score it as if the risk controls were 100% effective, in place, and being used. But our risk audits show there's a gap between that score, that 100% control effectiveness, and reality. And so we needed to take that into account with insurance because, of course, the first thing that happens in a claim is they ask you questions about that. So we began to take that into account in our calculations. Simple example, seat belts, right? Just because when you use a seat belt, it's quite effective, but it doesn't mean you need to wear the seat belt. So its control effectiveness is effectively a 3 out of 5. But the airbag is 5 out of 5 because your car will not start if the airbag doesn't charge. The next element is KRI. See, one of the weaknesses to this whole equation is we're asking people to estimate the likelihood of that risk occurring. If we replace that manual estimate with actual hard data, I look at the number of complaints, the number of systems outages, the number of attempted breaches, then I can use that number to predict the insurance exposure as opposed to someone's guess. And that was one of the biggest variables we found as we assessed this client. And then finally, we used a KPI. So there's a whole bunch of risk records we just didn't get to. We didn't manage to get 100% of the risks. So we'd use an overall process indicator. So in the example of cyber risk, we'd look at the number of server outages. Now, just because a server outage doesn't mean it was a cyber attack, but we understand if there's more systems outages, something's broken in the system that we need to pay more attention to, and we get away from the predictive aspects of a KRI indicator. So those were the mix of formula elements that we used. If I go back up to signal strength looks at how strong these real-time indicators are as an indicator. So a high signal strength means they're predictive, repeatable, reliable, and useful in a risk system. But that wasn't always the case. So again, this is a more sophisticated formula. It's expensive and time-consuming to maintain, but gives you a way better answer on your required insurance. So now it becomes a smorgasbord of choosing which of these you want to include in your insurable risk index calculation.